The first sound that broke the glass-cold hush of the boardroom was not a gasp, but the soft thud of a briefcase sliding off a polished table. It was almost polite, the way the room tried to remain composed, suit straightening, a throat clearing, until the color left her face and the world narrowed to the flat, rapid way her lips did not move. For a second, the white noise of the city outside the tower windows seemed to go faint, as if every distant engine and siren had been muted to make room for the small, terrible detail. A woman in the center of power, a woman whose name was on headlines and whose voice signed contracts that moved millions, was collapsing under the branded logo of her own company. Bernard had been sweeping under that same table for years. He knew the boardroom by touch, the edges of the chairs, the sticky place near the window where someone had spilled coffee and pretended not to notice. He had been taught to be invisible in places like that, a shadow sliding past leather shoes, the hum of the HVA hiding his steps. He understood which curtains never needed dusting because the sunlight never reached them. He understood the unspoken choreography, the way the senior partners moved like planets and the staffers orbited politely. He understood, too, the sound that meant someone had fallen, a small, human accident that seemed out of place among glass and accounts. He put the mop down without thinking, felt the wet fibers stick to his palm, and crossed the room with hands that had scrubbed toilets and changed light bulbs and fixed the leaking radiator at the daycare his mother had once run. Up close, her skin was neither plastic nor celebrity gloss. She was pale, cool in the way people became cool when their bodies ceased obeying them. Her breath was shallow. The crowd rearranged itself into shock distance, an empty ring of tailored backs, and Bernard saw the hesitation in their eyes, the instant calculus, prestige, liability, optics. He knelt because his knees knew what to do. He had knelt at his daughter's bedside for fevers and nightmares. He had knelt in the hallway outside emergency rooms with a neighbor's hand cradling his shoulder. And now he found himself at the center of the glass cathedral with his palms on a chest that once opened markets. He clicked into the cadence he had once learned in a community CPR course. Check responsiveness, call out for help, compress. He set his hands, locked his fingers, and pushed down until it felt like pushing past plate armor. The sounds condensed, the thump of his palms, a hostess's muffled sob, the whisper of a phone as someone from legal whispered a direction. At 5,200 compressions a minute, time stretched and shattered and then reassembled into the rhythm of will against trajectory. For Bernard, it was mechanical and holy at once. There was no audience, only the body beneath his hands and the mind within it, the tiny imperative to keep air moving where life was failing.
For the executives watching, it was a crisis to be managed, a blur that would have to be fixed in a statement. She coughed like a tide breaking, eyes rolling to focus. For a breath, she looked straight at him, not at the suits, not at the cameras that would soon be pushed for angles, but at him. An odd, honest human recognition that felt like a very thin thread stretching between two different worlds. He heard his own breath, loud and foolish in the hush, and for a dissolving second he thought gratitude would be the next sound. Then a security hand closed on his shoulder, as if wanting to pry his ribs apart, as if the help he offered was a trespass. "Sir," Marcus said, the security chief's voice tight and official, "please step back." Bernard stepped away slowly. He inhaled the air in the boardroom, the expensive cologne, the antiseptic tang of glass cleaner, the metallic tang of fear, and felt his palms slick with somebody else's dread. He should have expected the protocol, a woman of that station, a closed room, an incident worth containing. But expectation and justice do not stand in the same place. Within hours, the incident had been folded into a sanitized line item at Human Resources: breach of conduct, inappropriate physical contact. Someone drafted a press release template that prioritized brand integrity. The cameras had caught the moment. In the footage, his shirt was blurred against her white blouse, and the narrative they wanted to create began to write itself in the hands of men whose primary talent was controlling perception. Where there had been a man trying to keep a life from slipping away, a story would be stitched that suited a boardroom's appetite for neatness. "They said I grabbed her," Bernard told Molly that night, but the words felt like clumsy hammers. He stood at the edge of their kitchen, socketing hope into the corners of a small, weary apartment, the heater coughing in the other room, a stuffed rabbit with one ear mended by his own careful stitches. Molly pressed her forehead against his palm like it was a warm planet at the center of a small universe. She was 6, and all the math that mattered to her kept inching towards lemonade stands, scraped knees, and the science fair. To Bernard, she was everything summers, rent checks, and loss could not eat. Janet, their neighbor, had baked a loaf and left it in a paper bag on the doormat. "Don't let them take your pride, Bernie," she said, as if pride could be parceled like loaves and kept in the cold. She had been a fixture in their building since before Molly was born, an observer, a wry-faced midwife of community gossip and small mercies.
She'd greeted Bernard with a look full of sorrow and anger combined, as if both feelings had learned to live under her eyebrows. She knew the ledger of their lives: runs to the clinic, missed Marking calls when he had to pick Molly up early, the way his hands smelled after a double shift.
By the time he got the letter, the crisp factory-stamped envelope from HR, Molly had been asleep on his chest. He read the paragraph about protecting the company's image with his finger pressed into the creased fold, as if he could smooth the words away. It used phrasing that sounded designed to discourage questions. This action is effective immediately. Further inquiries should be directed to legal. There was no invitation to explain, no space for the simple truth that he had counted compressions until fear and fatigue blurred them, that he'd been trying to do the one human thing he had been taught to do. Outside, at the corner where the bus came to take him home, lights bounced off wet pavement, and taxis passed with steam. He rode home with the letter in his coat like an accusation. The bus smelled of cold and old cleaning supplies. He folded himself into a seat by the window and watched the city slide past in silver gashes. In the reflecting glass, his face looked like every man who had ever been required to be invisible and punished when he wasn't. A passage from a pamphlet at the clinic, words about dignity, about the body's right to be met, pressed against his ribs like a secret. He thought about all the nights he had told Molly stories to keep the monsters of rent and layoffs at bay. Brave janitors who kept building lights from going out. Single dads who stitched hope out of old shirts. The social media angle came not as a leak but as a wave. Someone in PR had called an intern with an eager hand and a sharper eye. A still from the meeting, an ill-cropped frame where his arm obscured part of her face, was recaptured with the kind of brevity that kills reputations. CEO assaulted by janitor during meeting? Heads lined up to nod at the insinuation. It spread faster than a rumor in a hair salon. An easy villain, a photograph that suggested the worst. Comments ran like a field of small knives. They assumed motive, built a scaffold from guesswork. In the morning, posted headlines and clips sat on his neighbor's phone like a judgment. Bernard watched them as if from the bottom of a pool. Friends in other jobs texted thin condolences and emoji prayers. There was a spike in calls from reporters, a 2-sentence inquiry routed from a press office requesting comment. The woman he had camera briefing had a statement drafted that exonerated the company but did not mention him. He felt like a ghost in a place he had once frequented by necessity and dignity. In the months that followed, the economy did not feel like a distant spectral force. It was a concrete, measurable thing that could be counted and betrayed. He missed one rent payment because the unemployment forms were a maze, and the office that processed them took its own time. The landlord moved the notice into the hall with a rigid economy of language and a legal finality. Months of routine stability punctured by a single public misstep. The wheels of consequence had teeth.
Inside the tower, meanwhile, the first draft of damage controls sat on a desk with a coffee ring standing guard. Tyler Brigham, the CFO, with a jaw that had been taught to be severe by years of avoiding risk, made his decisions with a spreadsheet mind. His voice in the aftermath sounded like a thermostat. Adjust, measure, suppress. The brand could not be allowed to be messy. Tyler parsed the news cycle in meetings and concluded that perception was contagion. He advocated for swift, visible action. Bernard's dismissal had been a tidy solution. Remove the person who could become an unpredictable variable, present the story as necessary protocol, and rebuild the narrative in their favor. "We can't have images like that floating," Tyler said, to a room that nodded, because survival in corporate life was often a matter of respiration. Control what you can. Fiona Redford, Alexandra's personal assistant, and the person who knew the itinerary of both her calendar and moods, handled calls with a tenderness that bordered on devotion. She was the one who ordered the black sedans, who made sure the right photographers were briefed and the right names whispered into the right ears. She watched the headlines with a hand over her mouth and a ledger in her head. "We need to be careful how we proceed," she told Tyler, who'd already written the next day's talking points in his head. When the first sympathetic emails came, some from employees, some from people in the community, the initial corporate impulse was to respond with anodyne, sanitized phrases. There were regrets and clarifications and ongoing internal reviews, words chosen to neutralize, not to unmask. But the machine that protects brands is not built for gratitude or apology. It is built to persist. Alexandra woke in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and dusted sunlight, her throat raw with the memory of air that had been bought back. She did not remember collapsing, not in the vivid way one remembers a car crash,
Memory presented itself as fragments, laughter swallowed in mid-sentence, the weight of pressure in her chest, a soft, unfamiliar hand pressing down the right way. Later, when she watched the security footage, she replayed it as if she could edit herself into decency. The feed showed a man leaning in, hands locked and moving with a rhythm that belonged in emergency training. For a heartbeat, the grainy image made no sense. Who was this person who had the audacity to touch her in that room? Then she realized it was the janitor. The recognition moved through her like a wet hand across paper. She had been taught, like many in her position, the grammar of control, how to issue statements, how to have the right voice on television, how to make an apology look short and efficient so it wouldn't rent the fabric of investor confidence. But the footage didn't fit the script.
Here was a person whose work had always been to make other people's environments functional, whose hands were literally engaged in preventing disaster. The editors at the tabloids had already chosen a slant. The op-eds had pre-assembled their outrage and lined up commentators to shout about impropriety and risk. At night she found that she could not sleep. A small, stubborn image of his hands, calloused, sure, replayed behind her eyelids. She would wake and check her phone to find condolence messages and stern memos about brand strategy. Her body, however, remembered the fact of breath nearly lost and then recovered. Memory has no loyalty to power. Guilt, when it arrived, wasn't the fast, cinematic kind that people write about in novels. It was slow, persistent, the way a crack widens in a marble stair. She checked the security footage again, frame by frame, hand trembling over the keyboard. The angle shifted ever so slightly, and with it the entire moral geography of the incident. Where there had been a neat corporate narrative of risk and liability, now there was a human being who had acted without awareness of consequence beyond life and death. Tyler did not love guilt. Tyler loved order. He called her office the morning after the photos began to trend to propose a language for their response. "We can't humanize this," he said, his tone a climate-controlled certainty. "We have to contain it. The optics are bad. There will be lawsuits. There will be accusations. You know what the board will want." She listened, but the footage was there in her head, and she could not move past the way he had pressed on her breastbone until the back of her shirt clung with perspiration. There was no way to transpose that into damage control. Where she had thought a single reprimand or a brief line in the press might end it, the truth of the moment had lodged in her like a splinter. Word leaked, as words in big buildings do. A PR briefing called for decisive measures. Someone suggested a quick apology and a charitable donation in her name to avoid further attention. Others counseled silence. It was easier to let the narrative sweep over the small people who had been measures, tools in someone else's drama. For a long time, corporate life equated speed with wisdom. Across town, at an apartment where the radiator clanked like an old heart, Molly slept dreaming of stars she drew with crayons. Bernard sat at the kitchen table, circling the edges of that day in his head like a man cleaning a stubborn stain. He had saved a life and been punished for it. The logic of that injustice gnawed in him. A hero in a headline was a liability if he threatened the neatness of a brand. What bothered him was not the loss of job alone. It was the way the city, the people he'd passed daily, started to flatten him into a caricature. A man who had earned his bread with honest work was suddenly the subject of whispers and retweets.
Janet organized a small roster of neighbors to keep an eye on the family. Marcus, the security chief from the tower, would later tell the internal review that he had been focused on chain of command and safety. The difference between focus and compassion had always remained an unbridgeable gulf to Bernard. He took the kids to school every morning when he had a job. Now he walked Molly to the bus and felt the weight of her trust like a new mortgage payment. "You're my brave hero, Daddy," she said once, pressing a hand to his cheek like she could hold him there. The phrase lodged and became complicated in his chest. He wanted to tell her about the world that would make a man invisible and then blame him for being seen. Instead, he told her a story about a janitor who fixed the streetlights and made the night safe. Outside the tower, the media device spun small, hungry waves, comment sections filled with conjectures and anger, with strangers casting judgments and images cropped to suggest the worst. Someone on an online forum skillfully blurred a frame and inserted a caption that read like accusation. The technology of rumor had a velocity and a cruelty of its own. Alexander learned this in the cold clarity of a penthouse the morning headlines arrived. The world judged faster than it could understand. Her morning briefings were full of bullet points about stakeholders and share price. She heard them and heard behind the hum of legalese the whisper of a different ledger, one written in human faces rather than dollar signs. She had learned, in a way that many with her history did,
to build institutions that could survive through decisions that removed inconvenient truths. But the footage was inconvenient in the wrong direction. It suggested that the inconvenient truth was not her vulnerability, but the company's willingness to smooth over the humanity that had saved her. Night after night, she watched the same frames. A man with a broom in the background appeared in the grain, and then in the foreground. His hands, callus-modeled, pressed to the rhythm of an old training. There was a solidity to his actions that infuriated her. Infuriated because the very thing he had done was simple and essential, and infuriated because the men around her preferred narrative to paradox. The recognition of that anger grew into something less theoretical than policy. It became a moral pressure. Her assistant, Fiona, watched her rehearse statements and took notes like a scribe. Fiona had a kind of nervous, practical compassion. She had been hired for her efficiency and never ceased to surprise her boss with small acts of humanity, a well-timed coffee, a discreet call to an exhausted director of philanthropy. "We can issue a clarification," Fiona suggested finally, folding her hands on the polished desk between them. "Or we can do nothing and let them have the story." "Do nothing," Tyler would say in the adjoining room, "is not an option."
But Fiona looked at Alexandra as if she could read the undercurrent of guilt and knew it could not simply be washed away by a statement. She saw the way her boss's fingers tightened into small knots when the footage showed the janitor's persistence. The first block of the story, the day the chest was pressed and the breath returned, ended in splintered ways. For Bernard, it folded into a dismissal and the slow shrinkage of a household budget. For Alexandra, it opened a fissure in her conscience that professional language could not fill. For Tyler and the machine of corporate protection, it became a problem to be solved with the same sterile tools that had always worked: narratives, press releases, and the controlled erosion of troublesome facts. If you're drawn in and want to follow how Bernard fights to reclaim his dignity in a world at rush to cast him as a villain, subscribe and keep watching. This is only the beginning of what he will face and what must be repaired. After the boardroom had cleared and the cleaning crew had been reassigned to the next marble corner, Bernard found himself moving through a city that had already taken its sides. The bus route he took snaked past the neighborhood where glass towers gave way to rows of brick houses, past places where people still left keys under fake stones, and where a woman ran a produce stand and remembered everyone's birthdays. He watched his reflection in the bus window and tried, futilely, to erase the shape the internet had made of him. The smear's force was not merely professional, it invaded the small architecture of home. Parents at Molly's school glanced a little longer. Teachers whose faces he had known for years offered a syntax of distance. Their eyes asked questions he felt compelled to answer with a smile that didn't reach his mouth. He had never been much for fighting. Most of his battles had been domestic, making sure the stew was hot, defending a child from bullies, teaching himself how to change a flat tire. Now, in public, he carried a label that made him both less and more than he had been. He went to the food pantry when the pantry needed it. He took odd jobs for friends who knew him as reliable. He lied to Molly when the lights flickered. "It's just a blown fuse," he said, though he was thinking of how a fuse could be a small linear thing, and a headline could be a seismic one. He slept badly and woke often as if something might happen and he would not be there to say he had been present when it did. In the tower, Tyler tightened protocols and reviewed security footage for details that might be used against them in the rumor mill. He had people assigned to monitor social chatter and the editorial slant of morning shows. He coached spokespeople to sound calm and humane while protecting the balance sheet. Those were the actions of a man whose ethics were calibrated by profit and reputation.
He was not heartless so much as he was perilously efficient at confusing expedience with goodness. There were moments in which small acts suggested the possibility of another way. A receptionist at the company, who had seen Bernard kneel without thinking twice, sent him a short message using an anonymous username. He saved her. You know that, right? The note was like a voting card in a box that might or might not be counted. Bernard folded it into his pocket like a benediction. And while outrage consolidated online and the company cataloged its risks, Alexandra felt herself rearranging the taxonomy of value she had always used. She had built things, business units, charities, schools, and always had a ledger for the cost and the benefit. But cost and benefit were blunt instruments when the conversation was about human breath. The footage haunted her, not in a way that would make for headlines, but in a way that made it impossible to sleep through the sound of the city breathing. The recognition that someone with nothing to gain may have acted without calculation struck at her like a moral quake. She did not yet know how to respond. To act quickly would be to upend the carefully engineered systems she had installed to protect herself and the company. To do nothing would be to allow an injustice to calcify. Both choices carried consequences. The question that pressed against her nameplate and her calendar was not only how to rectify a single man's name, but whether the institution she had helped craft could ever admit to being wrong. Outside, Bernard taped up a flyer on a telephone pole offering tutoring services. He watched a mother in a coat bend down to smooth idling children into the warmth of a car. He thought of possible futures and toll booths. He thought of the way the city had given him a path where his hands could be useful, and now those hands were used to judge him. He said a prayer in private, because he had few witnesses, and because that felt like one thing he could say without holding back. The tension at the end of these first days tightened into a choice that would be unavoidable: whether the woman whose breath was saved would use the power she possessed to undo the work of a brand and the men who kept it tidy, and whether Bernard would accept the help of someone whose life sat in a different ledger than his. The story had widened its circles: the personal, the procedural, the public. It had become less about the act in the moment and more about what people would do afterward, how a company would treat a worker who had been both necessary and inconvenient, and how a woman with the capacity to change things might live with the knowledge that she had been saved by a hands-on kindness. On a late rain-washed afternoon, Alexandra sat with the grainy footage paused on the frame that restless editors had already turned into gossip fuel. The janitor's face was in profile. Dirt and age marked the skin around his knuckles.
She had never thought of hands in that way before. Hands as maps of work, a geography of small injuries and endurance. The image opened something up that memo language could not close. She reached for her phone and scrolled to find the chain of authority that had allowed Bernard to be dismissed. There were meeting notes, email threads, a chain that made the decision look as if it had made itself. Policy, necessity, optics. Fiona watched from the doorway as her boss's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "We can issue a statement," she said softly. "We can clarify what happened. We can—" "No," Alexandra said. The single syllable landed like the closing of a door. "I need to find out what they told him." Fiona, who kept notebooks like a woman keeping small villages safe, knew that find out meant more than a call to human resources. It meant crossing lines she had been paid to respect. It meant poking into neighborhoods that the company had always seen from a helicopter. It meant, perhaps, acknowledging that a system that had supported her had failed someone who never had access to the same elevators. She called a number that was not on any company directory, a number from a list she had compiled in a sudden scramble to remember the humanity outside her boardroom's protective glass. "Get me anything on the janitor who administered aid in the boardroom," she said. Her voice did not sound like a CEO's for once. It sounded small, surprised by its own need. Fiona's shoulders tightened in the way people who make other people's lives run smoothly often do when invited into moral risk. "I'll pull the files," she said. "HR protocols, witness statements. Do you want me to contact legal?" "Not yet," Alexandra answered. "Just pull everything and find his name." As the assistant moved to obey, Alexandra sat with the paused frame on the screen. She watched the man in the image again and again until the pixelated edges blurred into a person whose life she might one day be qualified to disturb with apology. It was an uncomfortable dissonance. The woman who had been sustained by his hands was the same woman whose apparatus had contributed to his dismissal. She had power. She had a choice. And the choice would be public. Bernard, in his own life, had begun to count costs in a different language. The city called sometimes like a patient with a steady need. The landlord, the clinic, the school. He had a debt to keep, and those debts do not apologize for rumors. The smear was a weather system he could not control, and it rained on everything he had built, no matter how small. But the city also gave him small mercies. A woman at his church left a casserole on the stoop. A former colleague at a maintenance company called to say he might have a shift if a client could be convinced. Community was a slow insurance policy. It would not pay the bills, but it would keep the loneliness at bay.
The narrative that had started with a man pressing down on a chest and ended with a letter from Human Resources had not yet resolved, and as the days stacked, Each actor in the story, Bernard, Alexandra, Tyler, Fiona, Janet, Molly, moved on a map scrawled by choices and consequence. The city, as always, observed and absorbed. When Alexandra finally closed her laptop, the frame of the man in the video still flickered in the back of her eyes. The image had lodged in her as an accusation and an invitation. Her life had always been a series of calculated moves. For the first time, she felt the weight of an uncalculated moral responsibility. The thought of going to his neighborhood, of meeting this man who had saved her without asking for anything in return, made her feel as if she were descending stairs into a room she had not been taught to enter. She did not, in that moment, know whether he would accept her help. She only knew that the problem could no longer be outsourced to hospitality or PR. It would require conversation, humility, and perhaps, in time, a reckoning that would ask more of her than a press release ever would. Outside, Bernard folded the flyer with tutoring offers and tucked it into his pocket. He walked past the bank of elevators that had once swallowed him during his shifts, past the storefronts with their display lights, past a newspaper stand with a headline that looked like a gavel. The city kept moving, indifferent and beautiful, carrying 1,000 stories at once. He felt himself at the center of one that had to be lived, not merely survived. He did not know that somewhere in a high office, a woman watched footage of his hands and felt the first shoots of an unease that might, if tended carefully, turn into restitution. The world, like a great machine, kept humming. Buttons would be pushed, memos mailed, and statements issued. But some things were not fixed by corporate machinery. They were fixed, if they were fixed at all, by small acts that required pain and restraint, and the acknowledgement of asymmetry. The story that began with a breath regained was only beginning to insist that something else be given back. A name, a livelihood, a sliver of dignity. As night fell and neon replaced sun, both those at the bottom of the city and those at its apex woke to the reality that the coming weeks would decide more than a job. They would decide if a system that paid lip service to values would ever be asked to live them. They would decide if the man who had been made small by a photograph could ever stand large enough to help the next person who needed breath. Bernard slept badly, thinking of bobbing hospital monitors. Alexandra stepped over the boundary of strategy into an unfamiliar moral territory she had never budgeted for. Tyler sharpened his messaging and prepared for any fallout.
And somewhere in the back of Alexandra's mind, where the footage would not stop replaying, an idea took shape that would force each of them to act, or to be acted upon. The seasons had started to edge toward winter. Christmas lights would come, wrapped around trees and expectations. For Bernard and Molly, the season meant small rituals, cookies, a paper star, a single gift under a table lamp. For Alexandra, it meant a year-end review in the kinds of charitable giving that could be checked on a balance sheet. For both, the same calendar pressed in with the same indifferent deadlines: rent due, board meeting, the urgent necessity of a new narrative. The months ahead were full of possibility and peril. One choice, seemingly small, had already made itself. A woman with power had decided she could no longer rely on the easy tools of public relations to cover what had happened. She would look up from the ledger and look at the man whose hands had kept her breathing. She would have to step out of the predictable circles of her life and move into a neighborhood where cash registers rang to a different tune. The decision to look was itself an admission. It was not yet a remedy. It was only the first necessary motion toward what repair might look like. Bernard, unaware of the name being pulled for him from a glossy file, was making his own slow, stubborn list of what it meant to be a father and a worker in a world that rewarded invisibility for those on the wrong side of the elevator. He had not asked to be the hero in anyone's story. He had only tried to do the smallest human thing: keep a person alive. They were both moving toward a reckoning that would test their assumptions about power, about gratitude, and about what it is to make amends. The rest of the story would demand difficult choices and ugly truths. For now, both of them stood at their own thresholds, listening to the sound of the city and the quiet tick of a clock that would not be paused for either of them. The morning Alexandra stepped out of her penthouse and into a cab, the city seemed to take on a new texture, less as a backdrop for deals, more as a map of unfamiliar neighborhoods she had never walked through. She carried no press release, only a folded piece of paper with an address and a name she had practiced saying once or twice, as if practicing would make the reality easier. Fiona rode beside her with a tablet full of HR notes and a look that combined fear with resolve. Neither woman wore the armor of a press statement. Both wore clothes that could be mistaken for ordinary and therefore perhaps less threatening.
West Philly arrived as a cluster of stoops and porches, of small shops and smiling shopkeepers who knew each other's children. The sky that day was thin, and the air had the brittle clarity of early winter. Alexandra felt conspicuous in a wool coat that had cost more than the rent of many apartments on the block.
She kept her hands where they could not fidget with her phone. In the car, she practiced names she had only seen on memos, Bernard James Kellerman, until it began to feel human to say them aloud. Fiona had pulled everything she could, the file with the HR note, the email trail, and internal meeting roster. The ledger of decisions that led to Bernard's dismissal looked tidy in a spreadsheet, timestamps, signatories, a checkbox stamped, effective immediately. Fiona placed the tablet face down and said quietly, "We don't get to be surprised now. We go talk to him. We don't tell him what to feel." They knocked on a narrow door that was flanked by a faded wreath. Janet answered with a look that was equal parts suspicion and welcome, like someone who had been keeping a house and its secrets safe. The smell drifting out was of baking bread and something like balm. The apartment was alive with a small kingdom of coats and drawings and an urgency to be cared for. Molly was there, hair in a bedhead halo, eyes big and uncomprehending, and she watched Alexandra with a wary curiosity that made Alexandra's throat ache. "He's gone out," Janet said before anyone could ask. "Bus stop down the corner. Been walking a lot lately." They found him seated on a low bench with his head dipped into his hands, the city humming around him. He looked smaller than the footage, less heroic than a frame could make him. There were fresh lines at the corner of his eyes, and a bruise-colored tenderness across his chest where he'd been pressed. He had taken to wearing the same jacket every day, goosebumped where cold met cloth, and his hands, those hands that had been on her chest, were still the hands of work. Short nails, calluses like tiny metals. When Alexandra approached him, she felt suddenly inexperienced in the art of apology. She had written them in PR drafts, sterile, efficient, but she had never had to stand in front of a person and apply them like a balm. Her voice, when it came, was uneven. "Bernard?" she said. He did not look up at first. Perhaps he had been practicing not to be easily surprised by pity. Perhaps he had grown adept at guarding a small life. When he did look at her, there was not the immediate softening that her prepared lines had hoped for. There was instead a measured curiosity, an inventory being taken. "You worked at our building," he said. It was not a question so much as recognition. He coughed once, dryly, and then added, "You were there." "I know," Alexandra said. Words that might have been defensive in another room became simply true in the cold. What happened that day should never have been handled the way it was. I watched the footage. I saw, and then I saw what the company did. I'm sorry." The sentence felt like a first hinge opening. Bernard's eyes narrowed, not with anger alone, but with the protective instinct of a man whose life had someone small to guard. "Sorry doesn't pay the electric bill," he said.
It was not a challenge. It was a map back to the reality she had temporarily escaped. She had thought, naively, that an apology would be the fulcrum that shifted things. Instead, her apology was only a beginning. Bernard's distrust had a history. He had been treated like a disposable element of a system that preferred silence. Apologies, if they were to be worth anything, had to come with changes concrete enough to alter daily life. Fiona, efficient as ever, slid a small envelope from her bag. Inside were contact numbers, a statement drafted in simple language that Alexandra insisted not be used without Bernard's consent, and a card with the name of a housing coordinator, someone who could arrange immediate relief if there was a need. "We can help today," Fiona said. "Medical, housing, whatever you need. We can also have the company issue a statement clearing your name, but we will only do that if you want us to." Bernard's mouth tightened. He asked about the letter he had received. Was the company going to take it back? He wanted to know if the record could be amended. He wanted to know if the smear could be stopped. He wanted to know, in a practical sense, whether his daughter's bedtime would change from a candlelit negotiation to something steadier. "I will sign nothing under duress," he said at last, "and I won't have it look like I owe you for being alive." Alexandra had expected that line. She had rehearsed a dozen ways to say, "I won't ask you to owe me," but the rehearsal had not prepared her for the rawness of being in front of someone who had been discarded. She extended no more offers. She listened. She pledged not to use her power to coerce a narrative. They walked together, 3 blocks and then 2 more,
to a small emergency room where the staff knew the language of poverty and stress because it lived with them all the time. Bernard's breathing was shallow, and his blood pressure alarmed a nurse. They ran tests. The physician who assessed him found rib contusions consistent with compressions and a minor arrhythmia likely aggravated by severe stress and sleep deprivation. They gave him fluids, a regimen to stabilize his heart rhythm, and a stern but practical lecture about rest, a luxury he could not simply afford. "You're not going home to an empty house. There's a little one there," the doctor said. "We can help you with a social worker. Don't be stubborn about it. You're a father." Alexandra waited in the corridor while Bernard slept under a thin hospital blanket, the machine singing a steady, non-judgmental song. She had never sat in a public hospital like this, not as a donor or a passerby, but as a person whose actions had consequences that touched another human flesh. Her hands were folded in her lap like somebody's contrite child. When Bernard awoke, he watched her for a long moment. "You could have left," he said. "You could have written a check and stayed in your tower." "I could have," she said.
And that would have been the easy thing. "I'm sorry." The apology that followed was different now, less performance, more bearing witness. She did not tell him the ways the board had reacted or how Tyler had argued to contain liability. She confessed her own part, that she had signed decisions without understanding the human margin they had erased, that she had not asked who the janitor was when the camera flatteningly called him an image. She offered not only money or a public clearing, but structural remedies, a review of HR policies, a fund to protect employees when incidents occur, a mediation process that did not default to effective immediately as a strategy for repression. Bernard listened. He weighed each offer as if it were a coin. He had been offered things before, charity, sympathy, promises, that evaporated quickly. What he needed was durability, not a headline. He asked detailed questions about the proposed measures. Who would run the program? Would there be unbiased oversight? Would his selection to lead anything be based on merit and agency and not framed as a token? Alexandra replied with an honesty that surprised even her. "If you agree to be involved in designing anything, you'll report to a board with community representation. I'll recuse myself from any direct management role over your program. We'll set up a committee with external auditors. If that's not enough, I'll step further back." The promise mattered because she meant it. She took the step of writing an email that afternoon, short, direct, and stripped of corporate euphemism, addressed to HR, legal counsel, and the board, and admission that the company's immediate reaction had nominalized a person and that she wanted an independent review. She forwarded a request that Bernard's dismissal be frozen pending the review. The email would later become a point of contention in board meetings. For now, it was simply a line drawn in the sand. Word, however, did not work like a lighthouse. Tyler, who operated with the philosophy that reputations were the only acceptable currency for careers, did what he did best. He pushed back. He began quietly circulating an internal memo that framed Alexandra's actions as a risk to investor confidence and suggested a controlled retraction of any statements she might make. He argued that a sudden pivot would suggest instability at the top. He had allies who valued the balance sheet over bruises. He invoked legal counsel and the potential for allegations that would require defensive budgets. What Tyler underestimated was the visibility of contrition in an era that demanded accountability. Alexandra, when she had seen Bernard and heard the cadence of his life, found herself unable to settle for compromise. She used whatever leverage she had to accelerate the independent review. A third-party labor advocacy group, external counsel, and an ACLJ equivalent audit firm were brought in. She signed forms and approved budgets.
Fiona set up meetings. Letters of intent were penned. These were, by themselves, not cures. They were frameworks that might prevent future erasures. At the same time, Tyler began a quieter campaign. He leaked an old maintenance report to a morning show, an innocuous-sounding file of repairs, framed as unsatisfactory work. It was a smear by insinuation, and it landed on social feeds like winter frost. The commentators latched on, breathing suspicion into a room that had been wrestling with questions of propriety. Alexandra watched the headline counters climb, with the exhaustion of someone who suddenly had to fight with her own company in public. "He'll claw at anything," Fiona said over the phone. "He's afraid of precedent." "Then make the precedent," Alexandra responded. The sentence felt like a command she was learning to give herself. Bernard watched the headlines escalate from the sofa where he now sat. He had accepted temporary housing arranged by a community clinic after insisting that any aid not seem like a purchase of his dignity. He had allowed volunteers to bring groceries. He had allowed a small stipend as a bridge. Trust, he had taught himself, was not something to accept full without warranty. He read the news with a censorious patience.
When another screenshot surfaced, an old maintenance log with a line that could be read as late response, Bernard braced for the tide. He had learned how to live in a city where words were weapons. He knew the bad feeling of a rumor arriving like a storm. Alexandra, however, did more than issue statements. She convened a public town hall at a community center that sat between the tower and the neighborhoods she was beginning to learn. She invited employees, community leaders, and Bernard, if he would come. She made it clear she would speak, but not as a woman who wanted to throttle dissent. She would speak as a leader who had been saved from a kind of death and had the responsibility to ensure it did not happen again. The night of the town hall, the room smelled of hot coffee and the damp coats of those who had come to be heard. Seats filled with people whose lives had been overlooked in corporate models, maintenance staff, kitchen workers, receptionists. There were also shareholders who wanted reassurance and journalists who wanted sound bites. Alexandra took the stage and said simply, "I was saved on that day by a man your system called invisible. We failed him." Her words did not make the critics vanish. Tyler's allies scoffed, but the room's energy shifted. Bernard sat near the back, a careful presence. Molly curled against Janet's side. He had not been coaxed there. He had come because he wanted to hear in her own words what she would be willing to change, and whether the change would stand without her continuing intervention.
Alexandra outlined concrete steps: an independent review to be completed within a specified time frame, a new employee advocacy office with a budget ring-fenced from PR, mandatory de-escalation and anti-bias training for security and HR, and the creation of a well-being fund to be administered by a board with workers' representatives and an independent auditor. She promised the language would be plain, the process public, and that any rehiring or appointment would follow transparent criteria. She announced, too, that she would place herself under the same scrutiny. She would not be the final arbiter on any decisions that involved employees who claimed harm related to executive actions. Transparency, she said, is not just a PR term, it's governance. When she finished, a woman from the audience, a barista from a building across town, asked her if she could be trusted to sustain these changes beyond tonight's headlines. Alexandra admitted she could not guarantee perfect fidelity, but promised that she would be accountable. The minutes would be public, the auditing firm independent, and the community representatives would include people known to the neighborhood. It was a start. For Bernard, it was something more. Evidence that the woman whose breath he had returned was willing to apply repair in ways that might outlast an apology. He felt cautious gratitude. He felt wary. He felt the old ache of indignity. He also felt a flicker of something like possibility. Tyler, seeing his carefully built house of risk management begin to erode, retaliated in the only way he knew how. He wrote an internal memo that alleged procedural oversight and suggested that the company might be exposed to liability if Alexandra's personal regret drove policy. He pulled strings with a private attorney to challenge the independence of the audit. He used his network to seed doubts. But corporations are not monoliths. They are made of people whose loyalties can shift when the politics change. A disgruntled board member, uneasy with the headlines and the potential for a drawn-out governance crisis, quietly sided with Alexandra. The board voted to support the independent review and to place Tyler on administrative leave while irregularities in his handling of PR were examined. The leave was framed as procedural. For Tyler, it felt like a censure. The censure did not heal everything. The smear had changed the rhythm of Bernard's life. He had missed work opportunities, the landlord had been patient but not infinitely so. There were forms to fill and proof to produce. But the tide had turned. The independent review, once launched, found failures in protocol and an over-reliance on damage control rather than human dignity. The report emphasized the importance of transparent grievance procedures and recommended a worker-led oversight committee. The company issued a statement retracting the earlier language that had framed Bernard as a breach of conduct.
It apologized not as damage control, but as a moral admission. In those weeks, a curious thing happened. Bernard's story expanded beyond the single frame in which it had been flattened. Small local outlets ran human-centered profiles about his daughter, his late mother who had run a daycare, the way his hands had fixed community lights and street corners. People who had once been ready to pounce with accusations now listened to audio recordings of coworkers who had seen him kneel without hesitation. The currents of public opinion shifted in a way that was slow and sensible. Alexandra, meanwhile, found herself confronting a different cost. Her brand took a hit among certain investors, who equated uncertainty with incompetence. But the board, some members at least, began to see that a company with a conscience could be more durable.
She bore the fatigue of fighting with her own institution, and she bore a more intimate weariness, the weight of having been saved by a man she had once let the company push away. One evening, after a long series of meetings about the design of the well-being fund, Alexandra walked by the clinic where Bernard had been treated and found him speaking to a small cluster of cleaning staff. He was no longer simply the anonymous janitor. He was someone whose lived example now mattered to others. He spoke without grandiosity about dignity and practical things, breaks during shifts, transparency and discipline, access to mental health services. People nodded because he spoke the truth of their lives. When she approached, he looked at her as if weighing whether to engage. He had been offered roles before, tokens meant to silence. But this time the offer had come with structures, independent oversight, a transparent salary, an advisory board including workers' representatives. He could shape policy rather than be used as an emblem. "Will you accept being the director?" she asked, near whispered so it would not feel like a performance. He considered more than the role. He thought of Molly's school trips, the rent, the nights with no heat. He also thought of the many people who would be helped by someone who knew the work by heart. He set conditions: a counsel with a labor attorney, explicit protections against retaliation, a contract that stated his appointment would not be used to whitewash the company's mistakes. "Equal safeguards," he said, "not just words." "Agreed," Alexandra said. "I will spill whatever power I hold to make the safeguards enforceable, and I will not be in your chain of command." He agreed to consult with a lawyer, and then, after deliberation, accepted a role as the program's director, on terms he had helped write. The hiring process was public. He did not take it as a favor. He took it as a job he thought could make a difference. The company, as promised, created a neutral committee to oversee the hiring and to refuse any executive interference.
The day Bernard stood in a conference room to talk about the program he would help build, he felt the nervous ritual of public speaking crawl through him. Molly sat in the front row with Janet beside her, fidgeting with a bracelet. There were cameras and people taking notes, but the room felt grounded. He told the story not as a plea, but as instruction. What a break looked like for a cleaning worker. How an apology without action was insufficient. What concrete measures could prevent similar erasures. He spoke of dignity as a work practice. When he finished, applause arrived. Not the perfunctory clap of corporate theater, but the kind that rose from those who had been listened to. Some executives shifted in their chairs, unfamiliar with the sensation of being corrected in public by someone they had once dismissed. Tyler's absence was a quiet footnote. His campaign had failed to unseat the newfound momentum for reform. In the wake of the reform, something else began to change between Bernard and Alexandra. Something not dramatic, not cinematic, but human and small. She would visit the program's meetings as a non-managerial attendee. She would sit at the back and listen rather than direct. At the end of one such meeting, she lingered to speak in private to Bernard. "I wanted to say," she began, and faltered. He waited. He had seen 1,000 hesitant apologies. He had learned to protect his tenderness. "You saved my life," she said. "Not because you needed anything, not because you expected anything. I have spent my life making decisions. Sometimes I have been blind. If there is something left to my life beyond what I've built, it is the choice to stop being blind." Her voice thickened, and she took a breath. "I am drawn to you in ways that surprise me. I have this ridiculous selfish wish that you could—" She stopped, the words clumsy. Bernard's expression hardened a little at first, wary in a way that was not unkind. The dynamic of power between them had been carved by headlines and HR memos. Nothing in the last months had erased that history. He thought about Molly, and about how any relationship might ripple outward to affect her child's safety and routine. He thought about the way some men in power had used kindness as a lever before. "You need to know what I won't be," he said finally. "I won't be a thing you fix, or a story you tell to make yourself feel less guilty." "I don't want you as a fix," Alexandra said, immediate and earnest. "I would rather be transparent about everything. I will step back from anything that could give me leverage over you. I'll sign agreements to make sure of it. I will, if you want, submit to counseling with you, to mediation, to anything that makes this fair. I am not asking for this as payment. I'm asking because I feel for you and I want to see where it goes, but I will not make your life harder." The plea was direct. It was also, in a way, a form of apology. Begged, some would later write in columns with a rhetorical flourish, but there was nothing theatrical in it. There was only a woman offering vulnerability, and a man whose life had been catalogued by resilience. Bernard told her he needed time. He asked for boundaries. He wanted the relationship to be pursued without corporate trimmings, no meetings in boardrooms, and no public announcements that might make Molly the subject of gossip. He proposed a simple pact: public transparency about the nature of their relationship, consent to meet with a counselor who could mediate the change in power dynamics, and a cooling-off period where Alexandra would not make any unilateral decisions that could affect his employment or housing. She agreed to all of it, and then she took another surprising step. She announced to the board that she would recuse herself from any decisions involving the well-being fund, and that she would step down from any direct managerial responsibilities related to Bernard's appointment. She put the decision in writing and had it notarized. She also asked that a third party, someone independent and respected, be appointed to monitor conflicts of interest. It was an extraordinary gesture, because gestures like it are often performed as symbolic. She meant every word. Tyler's counterattacks dwindled after that. He tried a few last pushes, opinion columns suggesting impropriety, leaks implying mismanagement, but the public and the board had already seen a different kind of governance. The company instituted the Oversight Committee and strengthened whistleblower protections. Some executives who had relied on opacity found themselves out of favor. Alexandra and Bernard began, cautiously, the slow work of mutuality. Their first date, if it could be called that, was not a candlelit dinner, but a walk through a community market, where vendors sold hot corn and handmade mittens. They walked at a pace that respected the child's needs. Bernard introduced Alexandra to neighbors as someone who's trying in her own way. Alexandra introduced Bernard to board members who traded some of their arrogance for curiosity. They took sessions with a counselor who specialized in power asymmetry and couple dynamics. They learned to speak about fear, about status, about the scars that public humiliation leaves on a person. Molly, at first protective, came to like the way Alexandra listened to her about school plays and science projects. The relationship between the adults was never a secret, but it was also not a spectacle. It was negotiated. Alexandra's choices, recusing from oversight, agreeing to counseling, signing transparency measures, did not remove the history, but they altered the way power would function between them. Months passed. The Well-Being Fund launched with a modest first budget, carefully targeted to fund emergency housing, paid sick leave for lower-wage employees, and mental health services. A clear grievance process was published. The committee included worker representation and an independent auditor with a public report schedule. The change did not end structural inequality, but it created a way to prevent similar erasures from repeating unchecked. Bernard's role as director was not ceremonial. He oversaw training modules and convened listening sessions. He hired people from crews who had homework to pay and who wanted dignity. The change rippled beyond the tower. Other companies watched. Workers in neighboring buildings formed a coalition. Local newspapers ran profiles of workers who had found voice. The city council asked the company to meet with labor advocates to discuss municipal standards for worker protection. None of this was miraculous. None of it erased the months of fear or the bruises on Bernard's chest. But it was work that unfolded into new forms of justice, where previously there had been only ephemera. The romance, when it came into clearer view, was not a fairy tale. It was a slow accrual of shared vulnerability. There were nights when Alexandra would stare at old footage and feel panic at how official narratives had nearly cost Bernard's life. There were nights when Bernard would worry that any closeness might make Molly a target for gossip. They had fights, small, painful ones, about boundaries, about what recusal meant in practice, about the days when a headline could reshape reality. They resolved some fights with language, and others with rituals, Alexandra giving up invitations that involved Bernard in corporate contexts, Bernard insisting that any public photo must be taken with Molly's consent. One winter evening, just before Christmas, they walked together down a street where someone had strung lights across a row of trees. Molly skipped ahead with Janet, and for a moment the scene felt like a photograph of ordinary life. Alexandra stopped and faced Bernard. The air was cold. She reached for his hand, not as a CEO reaching for an employee, but as a woman offering friendship, and perhaps asking for more. He hesitated only for a moment before taking it. His hand was calloused and warm. The gesture was private, and not theatrical, a mutual agreement between two people who had negotiated the cost of intimacy, and the scaffolding needed to keep it healthy. "I don't know what's next," she said, voice small, "but I want to try, if you do." He looked at Molly, who was turning back with a snowflake on her coat sleeve. He looked at Janet, who gave a brief approving nod. He looked at Alexandra, and the way her eyes were honest and tired. "Slow," he said, "and not for the wrong reasons." "Slow," she agreed. They walked on, not toward a resolution guaranteed by headlines or corporate policy, but toward a future they would have to make together. The program Bernard helped design continued to grow with measured care. The company appointed an ombudsperson independent of the executive suite.
Tyler, after internal review and public scrutiny of his tactics, left the firm. Some would say he had been pushed, others that the pace of change simply outstripped his aptitude. Whatever the phrasing, the environment in the tower shifted in ways small employees could see. A new respect in scheduling, a check on security procedures, a space where someone could speak up without fear of being instantaneously erased. The epilogue was not a neat bow. There were challenges yet, funding disputes, the occasional reporter revisiting the story to ask variations of the same tired questions. There were nights when Bernard worried about his daughter's future, and days when Alexandra felt the sting of investor impatience. But there were also mornings when Molly's lunchbox was packed on time, and bills paid on schedule, when neighbors who had once flinched recognized Bernard on the street and offered an honest hello, when the well-being fund helped another worker avoid eviction because they had access to a bridge payment. At a community meeting in late spring, Bernard spoke again, this time to a packed room of workers and managers. He did not pound the podium or demand vengeance. He thanked the people who had believed him, named the allies, and then spoke of the work to come. We need systems that don't throw people away because a photo looks bad. We need processes that listen before they label. We need respect to be standard practice. The applause that followed was warm and human. In the back of the room, Alexandra watched him with a mixture of pride and quiet love. She had not only been saved, she had helped build something that might save others. That, she thought, would be the measure of any relationship, whether it protected dignity outside of themselves as well as within. One winter, another, following the one that had threatened to swallow so much, Molly drew a card for both of them. It was imperfect, the kind of art that belonged on refrigerators rather than frames. She had written "To my two daddies" by mistake, and then added "and a mommy" in an unmistakable scrawl. They laughed and kept the card anyway. In the end, the story that began with a breath regained became a ledger of small acts and sustained accountability. The company had not been transformed overnight. Systems had limits, but human repair, when genuinely pursued, had a habit of changing more than headlines. Bernard reclaimed more than a job. He became a voice for people who keep buildings running, and for those who had been too often invisible. Alexandra learned painfully and with humility that power could be used to shelter and not only to shield reputation. They did not marry that winter. They did not move in together or host glamorous parties. They did, however, agree to be honest in public and private, to keep a counselor as a mediator while they navigated life together, and to let their relationship unfold under conditions that protected Bernard's autonomy and Molly's safety.
When Alexandra first begged for his love back, it had been an utterance born of remorse, admiration, and a sudden awareness of vulnerability. What followed was less a romantic triumph than a series of choices, some bureaucratic, others tender, that together formed a new rhythm. If there is a moral, it is not an easy one. To repair a wrong requires more than a statement. It requires the patience to build structures that will prevent recurrence, the humility to step aside where necessary, and the courage to be vulnerable without using power as leverage. For Bernard, Alexandra, Molly, and the community around them, the work continued. They had no illusions about perfection, only the steady agreement to do better. If this story matters to you, if it stirs memories of moments when dignity was overlooked, or of people whose everyday labor goes unnoticed, share it. Tell us in the comments about a time someone stood up for you, or about a policy you wish your workplace had. Your voice can help shape how we think about repair.